Hey folks, how's it going? All good? Everybody's good? Today, let's discuss about context API in React. I think most of us React developers knows about context API. Context API is good. It's an API that we can use from React to store a value, okay? And then as long that the components are inside that provider, that context, it can access the value of that context. Before, you need to do a props drilling. So with context API, you have ways or options at least to access the value without a props drilling. Now, yes, it's good, but the thing is, the way you something like the recommended way now to access the context is to use this hook, useContext, this is quite good because it is convenient. Before, you use this render prop. Right? Now it's legacy way, it's not recommended. The modern, not basically modern, but when hooks arrive in React, this is now the recommended way to access the context, to use the useContext. Just like I said, this is quite convenient, but the problem with useContext is that hook can only be accessed inside a component or inside a custom hook. With useContext, if let's say this one button is consuming the context value, this subscribes this button component to this context, meaning whenever the context change, it re-renders the button. And the thing with context is that there's no fine-grained subscription there, meaning if let's say if the value of, let's say this, just imagine that this theme, which is coming from the theme context, is an object which has the properties of the value and the setter, which is a setter function. If there's a component that wants to access that setter function, even the setter is stable, but because it is part of that context value and let's say the other field changed, then that component will also re-render. So there is no fine-grained reactivity. So meaning with useContext, it just tells that this component, which is the button, is subscribed to the whole, to the value itself. So even that it tries to spread here, not spread, but basically let's say let's say if this component only access a single field, but basically that component is subscribing to the whole object. So whenever that context change, then the component also change. So that's the useContext. So something like it subscribes your component to the context. Compare to the render prop, it doesn't. Okay, this doesn't. If you're using this consumer component from the context, this is a render prop because it renders a element. You're passing a children, which is a render prop because it returns a JSX. This doesn't make the button component subscribe to the context, but only the JSX trigger.
We do have a mini app here. It's a person details. It's a form, right? It's a simple app where you can update Jane Doe here. It's her name and then her age. Let's say make it 37, and then save it. It shows that information here. We also have button which is reset, where it sets back to the default value when clicking it, and then this button. Let's discuss that one later on. Okay. So yeah, that's the app. Now we put this state into a context. Let's go to that codes. So here we do have person details. Person details renders this form, and then it has a context here. Use person. When we go to that use person, uses use context, returns the context from that, and then yeah, it basically just returns the context there, and then the context is holding this information. This is the this is the type of the context value. Has this person object, which is person, is basically this one, that type. It has name and age, and then some functions that we use to update the person, and also the reset, which we already saw it a while ago in that quick walkthrough. So that's the context. Now Inside this person form, we use that one. So the person form is this. So we use context there to display the inputs, these input fields, and also the action. Person summary is this component. So it shows the latest value of the person, which is the name and also the age. And that's basically it in most of the components here. Now, we do have two buttons, which we are going to focus on this reset. So button, this one is the button reset, which is this. So the on-click is the reset person, which coming from that context. Now, because we define the button here, so this reset person is coming from this, which person details is calling this use person, which is underload, just like I said, it uses that use context. Now, just like I said a while ago, that the use context makes your component subscribe to the context. So we know that reset person is something like that. Let's say this reset person is a stable function. Okay, so something like it doesn't change the reference function. Let's imagine to that one. So even that this is the reference doesn't change, but because it's coming from the context, so whenever that name or age change, then this person details will re-render, even that it is only consuming or using this reset person, because context doesn't have this fine-grained subscription. It subscribes the component to the whole context value, not to this reset person. So there's no fine-grained subscription or this selector concept, unlike with Redux where it has versus 10. So yeah, because this person did subscribe to that context, meaning whenever some changes on the context, it re-renders your person details. So we can clearly see here that if we update this one, save it, then person details get re-rendered. There are two logs here because this one log is coming from the strict mode because we wrap the app in strict mode. So that's basically, the idea of useContext. Yes, it is quite convenient, but it puts your component into this subscriber to that context value. So if the context is holding a context object and then it's been used across your app, lots of components that are updating that context, basically the page will re-render, which most likely it suffers to a performance issue. And that because of the use context, because use context is, like I said, subscribe to that context. And that's basically the reason why the core team, and even in in the React documentation, if you're going to, for the context, something like it is the recommended, in terms of the recommended usage, something like use context for a value that doesn't change often, because there's no fine-grained subscription, and it worst case creates these performance regressions. But the thing here is that if you go back to the documentation, there is a consumer API here, which is, like I said, once you use this, it doesn't if you use this consumer API, the button component here is not subscribing to that context. Rather, the JSX that is coming from or returned by this render prop, that's the only JSX that will subscribe to that context, not this component. So context API doesn't have this fine-grained subscription, but with consumer API with this, okay, something like this, this is the only React tree that will react or will re-render whenever there's a context change here. Meaning, if we use the consumer here, let's use that person context, consumer accepts a render prop. So this is a function. CTX, the context, and then there you go. And then here, CTX, there's that person. Remove this. Then with consumer API, it doesn't force the person details to subscribe to that context, but or rather, this is the only elements subscribing to that context. Let's save it. Let's go to that app. Let's see if it's still working. Updated name, updated age, save it. Before, once you save it, it renders the person details. But now, if you do this, it updates the information, that state, but no more re-render. Even resetting the context, no more re-render. Because we use consumer API, not the useContext. Okay, so yeah, not its legacy way. The consumer API is it's the legacy, not recommended. Use context. But if we're talking about performance and me, I do have experience, trying to fix a performance bottleneck coming from fixing a performance bottleneck, and one of the culprits that I always encounter in terms of a performance regression in React is context. Because of this, use context. This is quite convenient to use, but this is one of, just like I said, one of the culprits of the performance regression in my experience, because it makes your component subscribe to that context. Okay, which, because of that, we use a solution like this. We didn't use this consumer API, something like we create our own solution, but we use the pattern render prop for that context. Because yeah, on render prop, you can isolate the elements that will react to that changes on the context, just like what we did here. Yeah, we can move this one into component, right? And then use context there. That's the same thing, yes. But we didn't fix that idea of forcing that component it's still that component will subscribe to that context, right? Which that's basically the problem that we want to avoid. How can we avoid this component to not subscribe to that context API? Not this consumer API will fix that issue. So let's go back to that documentation. Legacy way, I don't know. Although you can build your own wrapper component and do this something like render prop, right? If you don't want to use this consumer API. Use context, I'm still using use context, but I just want to highlight in this video that use context, in my experience, is one of the issues that I have, culprits of a performance regressions. To solve that, at least React also provides us a way on how to solve that kind of issues coming from the context itself. And yeah, that's it.